Most years ending in a zero are kind of rollover years from the previous one. In the case of 1990, you might be expecting a lot of the things from the 80s to be rolling over into the 90s. Style, music, that kind of stuff. And to an extent, there was. But man, 1990, a lot of stuff happened that year that really kicked in the 90s. From Nelson Mandela being released from prison, to German reunification, to the Gulf War, which was the big story in 1990. And I shouldn't say the Gulf War, this was actually the build-up to the Gulf War. And to me, that's the big thing I remember from the 90s, is coming home from school and all the news, all the stations were constantly talking about the build-up to the Gulf War. So this is the first one we're talking about, not the second one. And this was when Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait and didn't really get the vibe that people were going to do that much about it. But it turns out they did. And the U.S. built up a major coalition to fight in that war. But of course, I was too young then to really understand the full impact of it. As a young boy, I'm just like, yay, war stuff, cool. And then later on, you kind of realize the impact that the war had on the world for generations afterwards, really, because we're still seeing the impact of that particular war. So here's some big events from 1990. In the 80s, it was all about Russia's bad, Cold War, a lot of the movies involved, like what's going to happen if Russia invades the US, or a lot of movies were post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear war kind of stuff. And then in the 90s, we get Gorbachev, and he's like, hey, everybody, let's chill. Let's take a step back and see if we can make peace. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they also have a problem with the countries that make up the USSR deciding hey, you know what? Crap's falling apart. We're going to get out. The first one was Lithuania. And they're like, we're going to declare our independence. And then you've got Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, a lot of the Georgia, getting out of the Soviet Union. This was primarily caused, actually, from the breakdown of East Germany and West Germany and the reunification of the country. It was basically the Cold War is over, is really what happened in 1990. Even though the process started before this, in 1990, German unification was agreed upon as this multi-unit plan. On June 22nd of that year, the famous Checkpoint Charlie is dismantled. In June, they also begin to merge their economies. And by October of that year, East Germany and the German Democratic Republic cease to exist, and they become Germany, also called the Federal Republic of Germany. And it's kind of great, actually, for the people that were in East Germany that could now travel freely between the two sides of Berlin and the country. So the wall came down, and this is where we see those images of people tearing down that wall. I'm sure we heard Reagan's speech, tear down this wall. Well, it happened. It got torn down. But it also led to the breakup of the USSR. And as the 90s roll on, the USSR, or I should say Russia now, tries to become our friend. Another interesting character that popped out, the Doctor of Death, or Jack Kevorkian. He rose to prominence as helping people with assisted suicide. So this is a very controversial issue, even to this day, to where if somebody is terminal and they just want to end their suffering, they know they're going to die, it's just prolonging that suffering. And what Jack Kevorkian did would assist them with that suicide. But of course, by law, that's murder. So there was a bit of conflict around that. He did continue to assist with suicides. He did some jail time for it. So it was a big thing back then. He's, of course, since passed away. And we actually have, I believe, 2 states in the U.S., unless another one's been added. But as far as I know, it's just Oregon and Washington State that now allow assisted suicide for certain reasons. And that was because of Jack Kevorkian and the work that he did at that time. Now, you could agree with it or not agree with it. I'm certainly not going to debate that here, but that is where we started to get that happening in the US. Another major event that happened in 1990 is the Hubble telescope. So this was launched into space via the Space Shuttle Discovery. And it had a bit of a problem when it first launched, and that's because it was a bit out of focus, and they later had to send up a mission to correct that. But the Hubble Space Telescope is still orbiting the Earth and has provided NASA and scientists with billions and billions of data of information going back to early origins of the universe. So a major technological advancement there, and that we are still benefiting from. So I mentioned the Gulf War. I think I should highlight that just a little bit more here. It was a coalition of 42 countries led by the US. We had George Bush Sr. in the White House at the time, and they called it Operation Desert Shield, which would later be called Desert Storm. And we'll get into that a bit more when we get into 1991. So at this point, it's really building up that coalition and getting U.S. forces into the Gulf. They're reactivating ships. We have battleships going over there and building that coalition with other countries, specifically the UK. And you might not know this because most people think of the 90s as not being Margaret Thatcher's era, but she actually was the Prime Minister of the UK throughout the majority of 1990. So she did lose her position in November to John Major, and John Major is the one who led the Conservative Party from 1990 to 1997, and he partnered up with the US and those other countries in that Gulf War. But when you think Margaret Thatcher, you think the 80s, and you should. She was the prime minister from 1979 to 1990, a very long-serving PM. If you look at current era United Kingdom, PMs usually only seem to last a few years anymore without having to get into a bit of controversy and getting removed from office. Okay, how about something fun? Let's talk music from 1990. And you might remember a song called Blame It on the Rain by Milli Vanilli, or Girl, You Know It's True, woo, ooh, ooh. So Milli Vanilli was a couple guys who did a little album that became huge, which they won a Grammy for. And in 1990, we found out they didn't actually sing on that album. That's right. The producer of it, Frank Ferran, hired other musicians to actually do the singing on the album and put Milli Vanilli up as the front guys. And this controversy came out. Their Grammy Award was revoked, but this was huge news in 1990. And of course, every talk show was making fun of this. There were skits on skit comedy shows making fun of it, and so it was a huge bit of news. They later came out with an album that had them singing on it, but of course by then all the damage had been done, and so there wasn't really too much they could do to recover from that. The number one song of 1990 was Hold On by Wilson Phillips. So Wilson Phillips, they actually formed in 1989. The group consisted of sisters, Carney and Wendy Wilson, who were the daughters of Brian Wilson, who you might know from the Beach Boys. And then also Cheyenne Phillips, who is the daughter of John and Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. And their 1990 album sold over 10 million copies worldwide, included 5 major U.S. singles, 4 of which went to the top 10, 3 of which went to number 1 on the Billboard Top 100s. They were nominated for 5 Grammy Awards, Best New Artist, Album of the Year, Song of the Year, Best Pop Vocal Performance by a Duo or Group. Huge. Wilson Phillips was everywhere that year. Speaking of girl power, interestingly, the top 3 songs of that year were all by women. Hold On by Wilson Phillips was number 1. It Must Have Been Love by Roxette, and Nothing Compares to You by Sinead O'Connor. So we've talked about Sinead O'Connor on the podcast, so if you haven't listened to that episode, check it out. It's a good one. Additionally, you did have some guys on there, not too many. Another Day in Paradise by Phil Collins was at number 7. At number 10 was Blaze of Glory by Bon Jovi, which was the theme song for the movie Young Guns. Additionally, at number 5 was Madonna's Vogue, Visions of Love, Mariah Carey. So it was a good year for women in the top 10. And I should call out number 45 on that list. I know, towards the bottom, but it was Ice Ice Baby by Vanilla Ice. So you'd probably think it would be a bit higher on the list. Maybe it was the previous year, maybe it was the year later. But anyway, everybody was singing Ice Ice Baby in 1990. I remember in high school, I was in high school at the time, and I was in a class, and we were, a little group of us at one point were sitting there trying to see who could do the lyrics to Ice Ice Baby the best. In sports, the big news was John McEnroe. So he was a major U.S. tennis player in the 80s and into 1990, where he got into a bit of trouble at the Grand Slam tournament in Australia for the Australian Open for basically throwing a tantrum. He didn't like one of the calls that a ref made, so he got huffy about that. At one point, he threw his racket onto the ground. McEnroe was kind of known for this type of behavior. That's kind of what made him famous, was his explosions of anger during matches. This time, however, went too far, and he actually got disqualified from it. And he was the first player to do so since 1963. So good job, John. In the world of books, you have Good Omens, the nice and accurate prophecies of Agnes Nutter, something that would become a series on Amazon over the past few years. An excellent series, by the way, and an excellent book. So if you haven't read it, check it out. I like it. It's by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Here's something you might not realize. Oh, the Places You'll Go by Dr. Seuss, or Dr. Seuss, as it's supposed to be pronounced. You might think that actually came out much sooner, but it didn't. It actually was released on January 22nd of 1990. It was actually his last book to be published before his death on 1991, or the last book to be published during his lifetime. I think they've published stuff since then. Another interesting fact about Oh, the Places You Will Go is it's his most popular book. It's sold more than any other Dr. Seuss book, which you would think, like, wait a minute, wouldn't like The Cat in the Hat or The Grinch, Who Stole Christmas, be more popular? I mean, they've been out longer. But no, actually, Oh, the Places You'll Go is actually a very popular gift given to people who are graduating high school or university. And I actually received a copy of this from my job once. So I don't know why they felt they needed to give these out to us, but we had one of those team, company, group meeting kind of things, those rah sessions that you have at companies sometimes. And for whatever reason, they decided to give us all a copy of Oh, the Places You'll Go. And I still have it, actually. And of course, we can't finish off mentioning the 90s without mentioning movies. Huge movie that year was Ghost, with the scene that has been parodied oh so many times of Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore working on a piece of pottery. And it was a huge movie at the time, and still really popular, I believe. I don't know. Pretty Woman. Pretty Woman, the kind I like to meet. Yep, that's right. That was number 2 on the list of domestic box offices for 1990. Number 3 on that list, Home Alone, the holiday classic that many people continue to watch to this day. The first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie was out. The Hunt for Red October, which I really enjoyed. Total Recall, Die Hard 2, Driving Miss Daisy, Dick Tracy, and Back to the Future Part 3, which came in at number 10 for domestic box office grosses. A lot of good movies came out that year. Days of Thunder, where Tom Cruise met Nicole Kidman. Additionally, Born on the 4th of July, also starring Tom Cruise. He had a good year. Met his future wife and had 2 movies in the top 20. Flatliners, the cult classic. and the major award-winning Dances with Wolves. So a lot of good stuff. Tango Cash technically ended up as a bit of a box office bomb, but I personally think it is a very underrated movie. And at number 27, Young Guns 2, as I mentioned, with the associated song. You had Rocky IV, Little Mermaid, Joe versus the Volcano, Kindergarten Cop, another excellent one that we've talked about on the podcast. So a lot of good stuff came out that year and is totally worth checking out. If you want to know what number one that was released during that year, it was Home Alone, followed up by Ghost, and then Dances with Wolves and Pretty Woman. So little different order because of the time that they were released, but all good stuff. So there you go. It was a big year with a lot of stuff happening. Wars, people getting released from prison to eventually become presidents of countries, to countries falling apart, to major movies and music extravaganzas and controversies. So this is the point where I say be sure to like, subscribe, follow, stay tuned, blah, 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 that kind of stuff that you hear at the end of these kind of things. And with that, I'll just say I'm out of here because it's time to start researching 1991.